How y'all doing? Yeah, is anyone tired from this weekend? Raise your hand. Okay, but is anyone still glad that they came this weekend even though they are tired? Have you had a good time this weekend? I don't know about you. I have had a great time myself. Honestly, though, I really do want to say this is going to be the last time that we're going to talk just us. And so I really want to say to each and every one of you, it really has been a pleasure to come down and visit with you all. Many of you I'm getting to see again, perhaps for the second time. And some of you I'm just meeting for the first time. And it's been really fun. I love getting to do this. This is absolutely the joy of my life, to be able to travel around and meet people like you and talk with you and hopefully teach you a few things. And I hope to teach you a few more things tonight. But before we get started, I do want to play a game, and I know you've played a million games, but this game is going to be really simple. You can actually do it right where you are seated. Here's how it's going to work. I am going to give you two different things. These things are going to be different from one another, and many of them are actually going to feel like they're opposites. And what I want you to do is I want you to think about what is the biggest difference between these two things. There's going to be a lot of things that you could choose from, but if you had to choose the biggest difference between these two things, sort of what would it be? I want you to sort of think that to yourself, and I might even ask you. So, to give you an example to start, Facebook and Instagram, right? Think right now. What would you say? In fact, someone raised their hand. What would you say is the biggest difference between Facebook and Instagram? Woody? The age group of people that use it, right? Like Instagram, how many of y'all are on Instagram? You use Instagram from time to time? Right. And Facebook, how many of y'all are on Facebook? You're old. That's just the way it is. I'm on Facebook too. I'm sorry. That's just the way it is, right? Okay, how about this one? Boys and girls. Now, there's a lot of things we could choose from here, right? A lot of things. And let's just get it out of the way right now. There's the anatomy difference, okay? Well, but what about the way that maybe boys and girls act? What's the biggest difference, you would say, between how boys and girls act? Who is that back there? Alexis? What?
A lot of boys, they play like sports where they tackle, they like to tackle, and girls
Yeah, boys are a bit more physical, I guess you would say, for the most part, yeah.
Boys are kind of stupid.
Shots fired at the boys from the boys. Boys are kind of stupid. Is that Gabby? Totally. And I don't want to talk stereotypes up here, right? But on the whole, boys can often be a little bit more physical. Boys will often let out their sort of aggression or their emotions physically, whereas girls, they might on the most part, might let it out in a bit more of an emotional way, if you will. Okay, let's do maybe one more. How about this one? Me and Becker. What would you say is the biggest difference between me and Becker, other than he is much better looking than I am? Like, what else?
You're better at basketball.
I wouldn't say that's true. He said, I'm better at basketball. I don't know if that's necessarily true. Y'all saw how I played today. It was rough. Alexis? What? Becker is taller, which I don't think was true last year. You have grown, my young friend. Good for you. All right, now one last one, and this one, I actually want you to just think to yourself, okay? So I just want you to think about it to yourself in your own head. What is the biggest difference between God and humans? Now, again, there's like a lot of things that we could list here. But just think in your own head, what, out of all the things that make us different from God, what do you think is the biggest difference between God and humans? There's a lot of things that you could choose from, right? Like, for example, you might say, we as humans are not God. That's a pretty obvious one, right? We are not God. However, the Bible does tell us that we are made in the image of God, meaning that we are meant to be a reflection of all of who God is in the world. So while we are not God, we are in some ways, we are like God. So you also might say it's our humanity, right? The fact that we are humans. And that's partially true as well. God is a divine being. And for us, we're just flesh and bone. So that's a pretty big difference. However, in Jesus, God did become human. God was flesh and bone. Jesus was flesh and bone, and he was a divine being. You see, the more I have thought about this question, the more I think the answer to it is one word: sin. That, to me, is the biggest difference between God and humans. It is sin. And unlike iniquity or transgressions, sin is a word that we hear a lot in church, right? Sometimes we even hear it too much. This is a word that we're pretty familiar with. We, as humans, we hear this in church, that we are sinful. We commit sins, each and every one of us. Whereas God does not. God is perfect. Even when God came to this earth as a human, the Bible tells us that Jesus committed no sin while he was here as a human on earth. So to me, that has to be the biggest difference between God and humans. And you can think about it this way. Sin separates the human from the holy. I want you to think about that. Sin separates the human from the holy, because we're going to be talking about that tonight. This weekend, as you all know, our theme is one, right? And we've been talking about a word, unity. We're talking about how we can create unity in our relationships. When we break trust through transgressions, we can bring unity through peace. This morning, we talked about iniquity. We talked about bringing unity in our world through justice, through looking out for the left out. But unity is not just something that happens in our relationships. Unity is not just something that happens in our churches or in our world, but we as humans, the Bible teaches that we as humans, we were actually created to live in unity with God as well. We talked about this a little bit in our very first session. On page 1 of the Bible, we get this picture of God and humans living in unity with one another. But then by page 3 of the Bible, what happens? Sin separates the human from the holy. And you could actually argue that the rest of the Old Testament is a story of human beings trying to be united once again with a holy God, but they are unable to because of their sin. And you could actually argue that the central conflict of the Bible, and even the central conflict of our lives here today, is how can a sinful people live in unity with a holy God? That's the question that I want you to ask yourself tonight. That's the question that we're going to be talking about. But in order for us to even begin to answer that question, we have to get a deeper understanding of two things. What is sin? And what does it mean to be holy? Now, like we said, unlike iniquity and transgression, these are two words that you have probably heard before. In fact, you've probably even used them before. But tonight, I want to talk about, what do these words really mean? And what do they have to do with our unity with God that we were created to live in? So, let's start with the word sin. Here's what I want you to do, a little exercise. I want you to think, right now, close your eyes, think in your head, and try and create a list of every sin you committed today. Just today. Not this week, not this month, not your whole life. Just try and think every sin you committed today. Maybe you weren't very kind to someone during a game that we were playing earlier. Maybe you sort of gave a half effort during the service project, or you told a lie, or I don't know, you stubbed your toe and you said a swear word. I don't know, whatever. Just try and list them if you can. Now, my guess is that as you're creating this list, you can open your eyes now. My guess is, as you were creating that list, your list probably consisted of bad behaviors, right? Raise your hand if your list consisted of pretty much bad behaviors or bad things that you did or said or thought, right? Yeah, because that's what most of us think about when we think about sin, like the examples I gave earlier. Things like swearing or saying bad words, being selfish, lying. This is how we think about sin. There are good behaviors, and then there are bad, sinful behaviors. And that is part of what sin is. But again, the Bible's definition of sin is actually a bit more intense than that. The Bible's word for sin, it actually describes a failure to hit a goal or a failure to fulfill that goal. So I want you to think about like a dartboard, right? Any of you ever play darts in here? You've seen a dartboard, right? In the middle, what do you have? The bullseye, yeah? And the goal, when you're playing darts, is to throw your dart directly into that bullseye. You want to hit the bullseye, right? That's the goal. That's the mark you are trying to hit. Now, when you play darts, if I don't hit the bullseye perfectly in the center, that's okay. I still get points, right? I still might even be able to win, depending on who I'm playing. But according to the Bible's definition, anything other than a perfect bullseye, that is actually sin. According to the Bible, sin, all sin means, is missing the mark. Sin means missing the mark. It is a failure to fulfill your goal perfectly. Now, that of course begs the question, what is the goal, right? Well, Jesus made this very clear. His disciples one day, they were asking him, they said, "Teacher, what is the greatest commandment?" Like if you had to choose one, what would it be? And Jesus, in that moment, he makes it very clear to his disciples and to his followers that the goal of the Christian life, the mission, the purpose, the mark that we are trying to hit is to love God and to love people. That's it. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. Love others as you love yourself. Which means, then, that any time you or I fail to love another person or love God perfectly, we sin. Ouch, right? Like, when I found that out, like, I thought I was a much better person. But do you know how often I have loved God perfectly in my life? Doesn't happen a whole lot, right? Like, do you know how many times I have shown love to another person without any sort of selfishness or any sort of flaw? If I'm honest with you, I don't know if that has ever happened in my life. The Bible's definition of sin, you see, it is so much more than just a list of bad behaviors, a list of things that Christians aren't allowed to do. We sin anytime we fall short of living the life that God has called us to live. That's what it is. That's why in Romans chapter 3, the Bible says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." The reality is, I couldn't make a list of all the sins I committed today if I tried. Because you and I, we are constantly falling short of the goal. We are constantly missing the mark because we do not love God perfectly. And as hard as we try, we aren't able to love others perfectly either. So, we understand what sin is. We might be a little bit more depressed than we were at the beginning of this message. We might feel like a little bit worse of a person, a little bit worse of a Christian, but the reality is we understand now what sin is. Sin means missing the mark. Now let's talk about what it means to be holy. Again, most of us have heard the word holy. You probably have sung the word holy many, many times. And when we think about this word holy, usually we think about being good, right? We think about being morally perfect. Being holy means you do what? You do the right thing, right? But again, I'm not saying that definition is wrong. I'm saying that most of us have actually a limited definition of what the word means. Because the Bible's definition, again, it goes a little bit deeper than that. In the Bible, holiness is actually described not just as being good, but it is an ultimate form of goodness. In fact, to be holy means that you are so good that your goodness actually makes you unique. It makes you set apart. It is actually your defining feature that makes you different from other people. So it's like, for me, I'm tall, and that's one of many features that I have. But if someone who is 7'3" walked into the room, they're truly tall. Like, that is their defining feature. That's something they walk in the room. You have to notice that. It sets them apart. It makes them unique. Holiness is being so good that it makes you different. That's why God is referred to as holy many times in the Bible. Specifically in Psalm 77, it says, "Your ways, God, are holy." What God is as great as our God? You see, our God is holy because he is so awesome. He is so right. He is so pure, so good that it actually makes him different. It sets him apart. He's unique from any other God. This is what it means to be holy. So, let's review. Sin means missing the mark, failure to fulfill a goal. Holy means set apart. Sin means missing the mark, a failure, in other words, a failure to be perfectly good, whereas holy means being set apart because you already are perfectly good. And so we, as humans, we have sin because we fail time and time again to be perfectly good. And so how can we relate, how can we be united with a holy God who is perfectly good? So we return to the question that we had earlier. How can sinful people live in unity with a holy God? We are not perfectly good, so how could we ever be one with anything or anyone who is perfectly good? Well, God's solution to this problem, rather than to allow us to continually miss the mark, rather than to allow us to feel the consequences of that by having to live in this separation from him, God's solution to a sinful humanity was actually to become a human himself. And Jesus was the first human ever to not miss the mark. Every human in the Bible, every human in all of history before Jesus, they missed the mark. Jesus, when he was on this earth, he loved God and he loved people perfectly. Jesus fulfilled the goal. He committed no sin. Jesus was a holy human. And because of that, he was able to be united. He was able to live as one with a holy God. And then on the cross, what Jesus did, which is so utterly backwards and so utterly beautiful when you understand it, is on the cross, Jesus took our sin and he gave us his holiness. A holiness that we didn't deserve, holiness we did nothing to earn. On the cross, Jesus, he took our separation from God and he actually traded his unity with God. What Jesus on the cross said, he said, okay, you take my place and I will take yours. I'm willing to give my life so that you can actually live as you were created to live. You see, Jesus is the bridge from missing the mark to set apart. Jesus is where we have to go. Jesus is what we have to walk through in order for sinful people to finally live as they were created to live, as one with God. When I was 17 years old, I was asked to give my testimony for the first time. How many of you have ever given your testimony in front of a group of people before? Maybe it was here, maybe something like that. Very cool, very cool. So I was asked to do this when I was 17. It was the first time I'd ever done it. I was asked to do it at this summer camp that I had gone to for many years. And this was a summer camp. I got saved at that summer camp when I was 13 years old. I made a decision to follow Jesus at that camp. And so now I had graduated high school. And the counselors, they had asked me, would I come back and share my testimony at this camp? And so I agreed to do it. And I remember the night before I was going to tell my story in front of that camp, I was lying in bed and I was thinking about what I was going to say. And I started to freak out a little bit. My breathing got really short and I started sweating and I started getting really nervous and I had a full-on panic attack because I was reflecting on the last several years of my life since I got saved and since I became a Christian. And I knew that even though I was saved, I knew that I had spent the majority of my high school years missing the mark. And when I tell you that, I don't mean I just wasn't loving God perfectly, but I was still loving him. I'll be totally honest with you. The majority of my high school years, I was completely disinterested in God, even though I was saved. Like, I wasn't even on the dartboard, right? Much less hitting a perfect bullseye. And I knew this. I knew the truth. I knew that some of the behaviors and some of the patterns in my life, and honestly, my disinterest in God, I knew that this is how I was living. But here's the thing. I was keeping all of that a secret. I had kept all of that brokenness in my relationship with God. I kept all of that hidden from my family, from my community, from everybody. That's the reality of how I was living. And I walked around pretending, right? I walked around pretty much all of high school pretending that I was hitting the mark, pretending that I was living as this good, perfect guy. This is just my story. But the reality is that in all of my pretending, I was just creating more brokenness. In all of my pretending, every secret sin that I had, every lie that I told, every secret that I kept, it was just creating more separation between me and God. In reality, it was actually just causing me to miss the mark even further. And so I'm in my bed and I'm freaking out about this. And the next night I go and I'm standing in front of the camp, and it was about 100 of my peers, my friends, little brothers and sisters of friends of mine who I knew looked up to me as a leader in that community. And instead of making up a story, this story about how I got saved and all of a sudden I became this great, perfect Christian guy, I was honest with them. I told them, I confessed to them that night that even though I was saved, even though I was a Christian, I was still missing the mark. I was still making tons of mistakes. I was still really, really messed up in a lot of ways. And I want to be clear, I'm standing here tonight on this stage in front of you all, I'm still missing the mark. I want you all to know that I'm still making mistakes. I am still, every day, I fail to love God and love others perfectly. That's just the reality. For me, for you, for all of us. But that night, as I stood at that camp, I told them the good news. And it's the same good news that I want to share with you all tonight, that when I was missing the mark, Jesus came into my life and he set me apart. What Jesus did for me was he took my sin and gave me his holiness. The reality of what Jesus did in my life is he took this separation from God that I had been creating as a Christian. I'd been creating this separation for years. And Jesus came and he took my separation and he gave me his holiness. And now, through Jesus, I know that there is nothing that could separate me. That's the good news. Is that through Jesus, there is nothing that could separate me from living as one with God. And I want you to know tonight that through Jesus, there's nothing that could separate you either. There is no mistake that you've made. It doesn't matter how many times you have missed the mark. It doesn't matter how far off from the mark you are. It doesn't matter what relationships or what brokenness or what lies you have told. It doesn't matter. Through Jesus, you are able to live as one with God, which, by the way, is exactly how you were created to live. Jesus is the bridge from missing the mark to set apart. For you tonight, Jesus is the bridge from you're not good enough to you're actually fully loved. Jesus is the bridge from you'll never measure up. You'll never be able to do it on your own, to you are fully accepted, exactly as you are. And you see, when we begin to live that way, when we accept Jesus' invitation to live in unity with God, that is when we are set free to go and bring unity elsewhere. That's when we're set free to bring unity, like we're talking about, in our relationships, in our society, in our communities. You see, we were created for unity to help bring more unity. That's why you're here on this earth. God wants to actually use you to help bring this oneness that we're talking about, to help bring this unity that you were created for. He wants to use you to help bring more of it in the world. But before we do that, before we recognize the transgressions in our lives and use peace to put the pieces back together, before we recognize iniquity in our culture and seek to bring God's justice, to seek to look out for the left out, before we do any of that stuff, we have to find unity with God. And that is only found through Jesus. And so I wonder if tonight you perhaps are ready to kind of raise your hand or stand up and say, I have been missing the mark. And I need Jesus to set me apart. Maybe you're here tonight, and even though you go to a church, you've kind of grown up in a Christian home, you've never really made that decision. You've never really realized that sin wasn't just the bad behaviors that you were doing, but sin was actually almost every moment of every day for you. And in order to create unity between you and God, you actually needed to say, Jesus, I need you to set me apart. And so for the rest of our night tonight, we're going to sing in a little bit. I want you to know that we use a phrase in church sometimes, that the altar is open. And what that means is, any of you who perhaps are ready to make that decision for the first time, who you're in a place where you're ready to say that, you're ready to confess that you've missed the mark, and you want Jesus to be that bridge for you, when we are singing, you can come down and you can pray that prayer. It's open for you. It's also open, by the way, for those of you who maybe have made that decision in the past, but maybe tonight you need to make a fresh confession. And you need a fresh reminder that even though, as a Christian like me, you have been missing the mark for years, you need a fresh reminder that Jesus is still the bridge. That even though you have behaviors, even though you have things in your life that make you feel separated from God, the objective reality is that nothing in your life could ever separate you from God again once you are in Jesus. Wherever you're at on this sort of journey tonight, I want to encourage you, as we're singing, come on down here. And maybe you don't really know what to do. You can come down to these stairs over here. You can kneel. And you can say this very simple prayer. All you have to do is just say, God, I have missed the mark. I need Jesus to set me apart. If you don't have the words, just repeat that prayer. Hey friends, thank you so much for watching this video. I wanted to let you know that the whole message from today's video can actually be found on my podcast. It's called The Joncast, and you can find it absolutely anywhere you get your podcast. That is where I am putting full sermons that I am teaching every single week. Those episodes come out. And so if you're a person who likes podcasts, who wants to keep up with sort of the sermon content that I am posting here on YouTube, but maybe you don't have time to sit down and watch it, you can listen to it on the go via the Joncast. Again, that is available literally anywhere you can get your podcast. I hope you will subscribe to the Joncast today. I hope you'll also subscribe to this channel if you're not subscribed. That's all I have for you today. I love you all. Keep being awesome.